Good afternoon. I recognize that sort of the last thing between us and drinks is us, but we're going to do the best we can here. Now, I've got a couple people who are going to join me. We're going to reference some questions over to Scott and Lance in a minute. We'll get them introduced. But before we get there, one of the things we wanted to do is sort of share our latest research around this topic of disruption. And let me see if this works here. Okay, well, let's start with this idea about disruption. Because listen, this is what I do. You know, like I'm 20 years at Deloitte in the retail practice. I'm our Chief Retail Innovation Officer. And what I try and do is drive research and drive our conversation around the conventional wisdom that we see that exists in the marketplace that we're not sure is always correct. In fact, if you've seen some of the research we've done in the past, we've taken on sort of one point after another from conventional wisdom, either to prove that maybe it's not exactly right or to prove that, in fact, it's wrong. And so we're taking on this topic around disruption because we're all talking about it, and this whole room believes that disruption is happening. But I would tell you, I spend time with the retail executives across the country, and in the C-suite, there's not necessarily a point of view that it's absolutely happening. In fact, there's a debate going on. You know, we all know that retail's soft, but the question is it structural or is it cyclical? I mean, you know, we've heard last winter was warm, and maybe this winter will be cool again. Skinny jeans was the last major trend, and we just need to have another major trend. And those kind of questions are out there. And so what we want to do is we want to look closely at this. We also know that conventional wisdom exists. If you read Wall Street Journal, they say, oh, it's a battle between bricks and mortar and online. Another piece of conventional wisdom. Is that really true? Because if you look in the marketplace and you go, what are the biggest, most innovative, powerful forces in retail? You could go, well, TJX and Costco and Aldi and Zara and H&M and Primark. And by the way, I'm going down a list of all non-digital retailers, right? So if the disruption is really online versus bricks and mortar, is that true? Or if you looked at the biggest retailers in the US, the biggest retailers, they all have an online business too. And by the way, the secret here is that every one of their online businesses, generally speaking, is growing faster than the 16% that e-commerce is growing. So that actually means that they're all playing in online. Not only that, but they're winning at online. Think about that for a minute. They're growing faster than the marketplace is growing, so they're stealing share from somebody. So they're not losing the online battle per se. They're actually growing faster than the marketplace is growing. So you have to look at all these topics and go, what's really going on? And that's what we've done. We have a report that's coming out next week called the Retail Volatility Index, where we've looked at that. I'm going to share a bunch of data, and I'm going to ask Scott and Lance to give us their perspectives on and reactions to the data and sort of represent within their organizations whether or not they see these debates going on. So I apologize in advance, and we've had a conversation about this. A bunch of data I'm going to work our way through, but I think it's pretty interesting stuff, and you guys are sort of getting a sneak preview. Now, the first thing that's happening we have to recognize is that Moore's Law is in effect, right? For anybody that doesn't understand Moore's Law, I saw sort of a question over there. That's fine. You can have questions around all this stuff. That's exactly what we're trying to do is question this. Moore's Law, right, if you're familiar with technology, is this law that there's a doubling of price capacity of technology every 18 months, right? And they've studied it and said, look, this has actually been in effect not just around transistors and circuit boards, but technology broadly. And what that means is you go back 100 years, and every 18 months there's a doubling. Just think about it, the doubling of the price, performance, and computing power. So think about something like Siri. Where we sit today, Siri is as good as it is, and it's taken 100 years worth of computing advances to get exactly where we're at today. And if you believe in Moore's Law, and there's many people who do, and a lot of empirical data that says it's true, that means that 18 months from now, Siri will be twice as good. Think about that. 100 years to get to where we're at today, and that one technology will be twice as good in 18 months, and in 18 more months it will be twice as good, and 18 more months it's twice as good. So what that is, it's an exponential curve. The other thing that we see that happens when we study industries is as industries take on digital properties, the industries begin to adopt the same trends as Moore's Law, because the industry becomes digital as well. And actually what we see, and I'm going to talk about this, is the disruption we see occurring is absolutely being caused by technology, but maybe not the way that the market thinks about it. Because the market generally thinks, oh, that's websites and mobile devices. But when you dig into it, you actually find that the effects are more profound. We'll hit on those. So you have to understand that, because if you believe that, then what happens when technology affects an industry is we move from scarcity to abundance. And this is what happens. Time and time again, this is what happens. People ask me, oh, is this a race to the bottom? And I go, good, yes, it is. You've got it, because that's what happens. That's how economics work, right? As technology moves us from scarcity to abundance, and just sort of think about any sort of retail thing you might have bought. I go back 40 years ago, when I'm a kid in Wichita, Kansas. My mom's got the Ford LTD. She loads up the kids to go shopping, right? Well, how many choices did she have for her shopping experiences, right? Think about it. And I'd probably say she had 3, 4, 5, opportunities. Today, the same mom has thousands of opportunities. And what that is a movement from scarcity to abundance. And here's an example. You look across industries, because this example of how this plays itself out is not unique to retail. It plays itself out, and I use a media example here. I was at dinner at the World Retail Congress in Dubai recently with many of my colleagues globally, and we were all talking about our kids. And so, my son's 10 years old, and he watches these YouTube videos while he plays video games. He watches crazy stuff that I can't even imagine. One of the dads told me his son watches this video. These are called Kinder Eggs. And the video is simply this. They open it up, and there's a toy inside, and they show it. And then they open another one up, and there's a toy inside, and they show it. And they do that over and over again. Think about that for a minute, that's a real business for somebody. By the way, look at the number of hits that this video has. It's crazy, right? So what I'm talking about is moving from scarcity to abundance. Again, kid, Wichita, Kansas, 40 years ago, what you had 3 television channels, right? Distribution channels were very controlled. The amount of content that was produced was very controlled by those distribution channels. As the barriers to entry fall, there's an explosion of content. There's an explosion of options. And that's actually what we see happening in retail. So let me talk about that for a minute. Because as we studied this, I had people saying to me, I had retail executives say to me, they'd say, disruption? Nah. Look, I've been in this business for 40 years, and it's always been cutthroat. It's always been tough. There's always been competitors. I had retail executives say to me, look, there's nothing different today than ever. I had somebody say, the customer's now in charge, and that's different. And a retail executive to me said, bullshit. Excuse my language. He said that because he's like, the customer's always been in charge. Nothing is different today. So what we set out to study and to say, is anything different, or is that conventional wisdom? Are we in an age of disruption or not? And we know that what retail executives need, the retail executives I work with, they need data. They want to know, because otherwise it's just a battle of opinions. So we set out to study this, and we came up with this way to measure. We call it the volatility of share, the retail volatility index. What we did is, the hypothesis was this, man, if you think back, there's Circuit City and there's Linens and things, JCPenney donated share, there's a lot of volatility with people giving and taking share, and clearly Amazon has been taking share from somewhere. Now, is there a way to measure that? And that's what we set out to try and do, and really we looked at what we call the VIX index on the stock market, which is just the measure of volatility. Stock market can be flat, but volatility can go skyrocketing, which means there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of trading of hands of stock. And so we said, we think the same thing's happening in retail, let's go study it. And here's what we discovered when we looked at it. I see there's no dates on here. This is roughly 2009 when it starts to shoot up here. I apologize for that. But what we found is there is an increasing volatility. The interesting part was when I used the anecdotes of the companies I just mentioned, a lot of that happened around the economic downturn, right? 2005, 6, 7, and that's actually not what we saw. What we saw was the volatility started to increase dramatically in 2009. So that leads us to the question of what's going on here? Is this an Amazon versus, bricks and mortar company? What's really going on? The interesting thing then we started to look at was, is it fragmenting or is it concentrating? If there's give and take, it could either be the big guys just taking more share or it could be something else. So we looked then deeper at concentration and fragmentation. And the interesting thing we discovered was from 2009 on, fragmentation. Okay, now think about that for a minute. The retail industry, you guys all work in the retail industry, for the last 100 years we've been on a path of consolidation. And something happened in 2009 that put us on a different path. It wasn't the economic downturn. It wasn't the number of companies that I mentioned, right, that were going out of business in 2005, 2006. Something has absolutely started to accelerate. By the way, just a stat, the top 25 retailers since 2009 have lost 2% of their concentrated share. So think about that. Whoever the top 25 are own a percentage of share. Since 2009, 2%. That's $70 billion worth of retail that used to be concentrated in the top 25 that's no longer concentrated. So you might say, oh, that's the Amazon effect. And I'd say, nope, Amazon's in the top 25. If you take Amazon out of the top 25 and you look at the remaining top 24, it's even worse in terms of how much share has been lost there. So something really interesting is going on, because what this tells us is the competition isn't the big company across the street. We've thought for the longest time your competitor was the big guy across the street. What this tells us is if there's a Pareto diagram of retail, it's a flattening of the diagram. Back to my example around media, this is exactly what the data tells us is happening. There's someone doing Kinder eggs out on the long tail who's actually able to aggregate demand and actually being competitive. Now, the further, when I look at that further, when we look at who is stealing and where that share is going, there certainly is an Amazon effect in place. I can't deny that. But when you look at the data deeper, you actually find it's well beyond that. It's well beyond that. So let me go forward with the data. We also then did an analysis and said, okay, if this volatility is occurring, how does it relate to stock price? And we found almost a one-for-one relationship between what's happening with the volatility and then what's happening to stock prices in retail. So, when we looked at it deeper, we find that there's several things going on here that are really incredibly important that go beyond websites and mobile devices. It's that the business model is changing. This idea about the economics of the industry are changing. The idea that there are reduced barriers to entry, and therefore there is a flood of new competition. And finally, that we are able to decouple the value chain, meaning that if we were to start a retailer today, first thing is we could do it in an hour with nothing more than a credit card, because we no longer need to own every component of the value chain. In fact, I can outsource effectively every component of the value chain now. I could have a call center up and running supporting me. I could have a distribution center that supported me. I could have a store that was up and running. And the important point there is that's all because technology made that possible, but it's not just through a lens of a consumer. We can now decouple the business in a way that we were able to decouple it before. And in doing so, what we're now able to do is operate as an ecosystem. If you look at Amazon, 50% of their sales now come from inventory they don't even own. So it's sort of the Uberization of the industry is occurring, and many people don't recognize it because it looks different than the Uberization of transportation. The fact that I can sell inventory much broader than I have to own is an element of this decoupling of the value chain. It's an element of this Uberization of the industry. So a couple more slides, and then we're going to get to the conversation. Again, I already apologize to my colleagues here about how much information I wanted to get through before we move to the conversation. But then we looked at performance, and we said, well, actually, let me introduce the framework. We took 400 retailers and we mapped them across this model, where on one axis there's experience. So is your experience as a brand a commodity, meaning low differentiation, or is it highly differentiated? So think for a minute, someone like CVS Pharmacy, and this is my own personal assessment, and I apologize to any companies that might be here that differ in their opinion. But imagine CVS Pharmacy and Apple stores as being, would a consumer pay more to go to the store and experience that brand, right? And you can probably think about brands because not everybody right now is suffering, right? Traffic is not down for everybody. There's some reason why consumers are still going, and in fact, increasingly so, to certain brands where they value the experience. So that's one axis. And the other is product differentiation, meaning I either sell commodity goods that you can buy thousands of other places, or I have exclusive goods you can't buy, anywhere else. So imagine Kraft macaroni and cheese is what I sell, or Victoria's Secret is what I sell. Okay? You can't buy Victoria's Secret at Amazon. You can buy that Kraft macaroni and cheese many, many different places. So basically, we took all 400 retailers and plotted them here. And here's what we found for performance. If you're up here, you're okay, 2.1% comps. Not bad. In fact, there's probably people here in the audience who would say, I'd take 2% comps. EBITDA is pretty good. Down here, 2.5% comps. Now, if you're up here, 6.5% comps. By the way, we've done this study now 3 years. The numbers slightly change. However, the fundamental story doesn't change over a 3-year period. If you're down here, though, here's where the problem lives. 0.5% comps, 1.4% EBITDA. Think about this. This quadrant down here is the quadrant that's really being attacked by what I would call cheaper, faster, easier. Okay? This is where online really is a threat. If you're in this top right quadrant, online is not a threat to you. Not to the same extent, right? Does that make sense? 3 years in a row, we've done that study, find the exact same thing. So what we discover based on all of this data is that we have to think differently about what is disruption. We have to think about who the new competitive set are and how we compete. This effectively tells us this is death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? As opposed to competition in the traditional way against the big competitor across the street. So just one more thing, and then we'll move on to this conversation. We've also got, one of my colleagues wrote this book called The 10 Types of Innovation. You may have seen this. They've done this study where we looked, and they said all types of innovation can be broken down into these 10 types. You could find this on Amazon, by the way. And you can see, and in some ways, it's sort of like a model around the value chain. But you can innovate on product. You can innovate on your network. You can innovate on the customer experience. Those are different sort of ways to innovate. By the way, in retail today, I think there's sort of a flaw around this term innovation. Many retailers have built their innovation centers. Many have put them out in San Francisco. Many of them have attached it to the digital team. And many of those are really focused on the customer experience. What that would say would be, we'd really look at this and say, how we engage customers is the type of innovation that we're working on. And I'm going to tell you why that's a bit of a flaw. So we studied then, and we looked at companies that have historically innovated, and we said, well, let's decompose the innovations that companies have come out with. What we find is largely the average number of types of innovation in use are 1. So we'll have an innovation team that's thinking about the customer experience, and we put beacons in stores, and we're going to talk to the consumers, and we're going to call that innovation. The problem is that's one type of innovation. When we look deeper, though, at the real value that's added, what we find is the more types of innovation that are combined into a particular innovation, that's where the shareholder value comes from. So we separated into those retailers that did innovation, or those companies that did innovation that failed to create shareholder value, and those that created significant shareholder value. And really the difference came out was the types of innovation that were involved to create that uniqueness and that differentiation in the model. So we use this model to help our clients sort of think about, what is this thing called innovation? Because right now we feel as if it's about it's an overused word, that anything interesting we're doing, we try and call it innovation. And what we try and do is use the model to highlight what is innovation, what is productive innovation versus something that you're doing that's interesting or cool. So I'd recommend, you can look online at the Harvard Business Review. There's a great piece that includes a detailed study of this book. But I thought I would introduce that as a tool that maybe you can take away from this conversation. So I think that's it. So, the idea here is that it's not the strongest of the species that survive. It's those that are best at adaptation. What we hope we've done, and when our paper comes out next week, we hope that this is the burning platform that says this isn't just a buzzword. Disruption is happening. There's a way to measure it. There's an index that we're going to be able to look at year over year to talk about the acceleration. Because if all this holds true, my earlier comment about Moore's Law that says this accelerates would say that the retail volatility index will continue to accelerate. And it's our plan to continue to study it. So with that, I'm going to turn to you guys and join in a conversation here. So would you mind with introductions? Lance, do you mind
Sure.
starting?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Lance Thornswood. For the last couple of years, I have been responsible for turning around the mobile business at JCPenney. In addition to that, I've had responsibility for customer experience across all of the consumer-facing digital channels. And then got handed the innovation studio, which for the 5 preceding years had never put anything into production. And the challenge to me was figure out if this is something we can save or kill it. And we've had a really good 2-year run of not killing it and trying to turn it around into something that's actually viable for the organization. So Pleasure to be here. I've worked with Kasey in the past and delighted to share the stage with you today.
Thank you.
Great. Hi, and I'm Scott Moore. So I run a company called M32. And so this is a group out of Minneapolis that has basically two areas of practice. One is strategic counseling, advisory work for companies in the consumer sector. The other is an innovation lab, which it's working to productize solutions, build products, build companies for companies and with companies. So that's my current job, but that's not clearly why I was not invited to be here. It was my last two roles. I was at Best Buy for a very long time. I was the chief marketing officer for Best Buy Mobile, which was Best Buy's significant foray into the mobile phone retailing space starting in 2006. So I led marketing for that group, was a merchant for that group, bought all connected accessories, which was, early Internet of Things, early connected home, saw the jawbone up when it was transistors. So that was a merchant buying job. And then when Hubert came in to lead the turnaround at Best Buy, I led marketing for the company for 2 years. And so that was basically the turnaround, let's take $1 billion of cost out of our operating model. Based on many of the forces and factors you just articulated, it's pretty clear where many of my old former company, our peer said, if you're at one of the major 30-plus-year-old retail companies and you're trying to manage this transition from being a big box retailer through being big box plus this .com site to a true omnichannel retailer against those forces and factors. There's not a single person. I was on a Google advisory council with the CMOs or CTOs for these companies. And it was interesting because we competed in different sectors. We're all fighting with Amazon. But it didn't matter what you were selling, whether it was paper or clothing or electronics. The forces and factors were hitting us all squarely in the same way. And so trying to figure out the main question, I think, if you're in the C-suite at this time is, great, we're figuring out what costs we need to take out and where. And if we're not doing that work, we're toast. So everyone's doing that work. The question is, how are we going to grow? How are we going to fund the growth? And also, it's a different kind of growth than we're used to. I love that point earlier today, or it was in your position. For 100 years, it was just consolidate, run it like brand marketing, create one power brand, pound it out, and we'll, excellence through repetitive behavior. Do the same thing the same way every single time, and that's what's going to win. And if you look at that slide about fragmentation, that is clearly not what's driving growth right now. And so I'm happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
It's like the difference between guerrilla warfare and conventional war. Like if you don't recognize that the battle has shifted and that your share isn't being lost to the traditional, it's being lost to this fragmentation of unknown players that you can't even comprehend, right? Unless you understand that, you fail to sort of fight the right war.
Yeah, absolutely. And back in, call it 2004, Best Buy had teed up, it was called the Three-Front War. We're fighting this evil set of people called Circuit City, which doesn't exist. But literally, we were built to fight that war, and we beat them. You had eBay, because they were surging online. All right, they did okay in consumer electronics, but they're not dominating share right now. And then our friends at Amazon. That's who we were worried about. But if you look at that slide and how the marketplace shifted so radically, a lot of it has to do with, in my opinion, the way the leaders are thinking at this time. I know how to fight this guy or gal in this way. Let me go to battle, and it's the guerrilla warfare. Like, wait a minute, where are they? Who am I fighting?
Well, let me ask the question of you guys, because the reason we took on the research in the first place is the number of conversations I personally have had, in the C-suite where I thought we're having the wrong conversation. Right, we're not talking. We've got to understand what's really going on, so we can. Give me your perspective. Do you see the struggle happening at the C-suite about what's really going on out there, or was I off base, sort of heading down this path?
Yeah, no, I actually absolutely see it, and it's really interesting. So I prior to JCPenney spent about 12 years working at Target or with Target. And it was very interesting to see the transformation in kind of my role, going from an organization that, with a little bit of stuff happening in 2007, Target kind of never felt the pain in a really serious way until a few years ago. Meanwhile, JCPenney was on the brink of going out of business, and to me it was remarkable to see the difference when you've literally hit bottom and you've got to absolutely look at your business differently. The JCPenney C-suite was so much more open to the entire range of what could be going on, and really much more open to consider, innovation across that range that you showed, to look at competition in an entirely different way. Whereas in the years leading up to that, when I was still at Target, there was still very much a mentality of, let's continue to pound away at the problems we understand. Let's continue to kind of run the business the way that we're used to running it. So it was really interesting to me to see
that change in dynamics. Yeah,
absolutely. And you kind of have to when you're at the bottom.
Yeah.
I
Scott,
I would agree. I don't think I've talked to any senior exec in retail in the last few years who hasn't understand the nature of the problem. It's the how to solve it is the core question, and it's anyone who's done work in growing anything, a garden, like it's sloppy. It's inconsistent. You're not quite sure what you're doing. You have to identify pockets of growth and figure out how to get them growing faster. And that's not the model. It's used many other areas of the economy. You see that. You fail fast and you crash, and you don't want someone leading your initiative unless they've crashed enough. Those types of behaviors are kind of set against, I don't know who's leading retail for Target right now, but I'm pretty sure that person came up through the stores, was an ass kicker in the stores, knew how to execute. And the game you just framed up it's just not that game. And I think there's a little bit of tolerance for ambiguity without just endless ideation. There has to be a new kind of focus. But I think that's what's making it so difficult for the companies in your lower left-hand quadrant. The other what's being in my current role, the other quadrants are super interesting, super exciting. The way it's very playful, the way they're adapting from different industries and really focusing on the customer experience and not just my NPS is higher kind of a way. But no, this is freaking awesome. When you heard the guy from Touch of Modern, there's an excitement to what they're doing there that's different from a lot of the other clothing, wherever the heck I bought these jeans. It wasn't the same vibe and the same passion. So.
Yeah, the model in the bottom left on the quadrant's interesting because the truth is, those models were built up around forward deployment of inventory, right? You think about when, again, I use the story about, when I was a kid. If you wanted to buy a flat screen TV, you went to the store because that's where the stuff was, right? That's where the information was. Right. That's where the associate was that was probably the most informed. And all of that's been decoupled, right? The idea that the stuff and the information about the stuff don't live together makes you have to go, well, the economics of that no longer are the same, right? So to me, there's so much more in the model that we're not talking about when we talk about, there's people buying it online. Because you guys have maybe seen our research too around the digital divide, where we really look at how is the entire shopping journey purchased or changed for people who are purchasing in the store. Our retail clients don't understand that either, because just because it's still happening in the store doesn't mean the entire shopping journey hasn't dramatically changed as well.
Yeah.
Right.
So here's a next question about the acceleration, right? Because what we showed was a trend, but we showed an acceleration of a trend. At least my retail clients, when I think about them, they would say, we've been doing a lot, right? We've been doing omnichannel, we're working. The problem is we haven't done enough, and it's now apparent, and we haven't done enough fast enough, right? Mm-hmm. So give me your reactions to that. Do you think that slows down? Do you think that acceleration continues? How do you see this playing itself out?
I think the key challenge is, if you go back to the nine box there, you had the one which was about decoupling the supply chain. Mm-hmm. And that's basically decoupling legacy, fill in the blank, legacy thinking, legacy assets, legacy shareholders, pick a topic. I think that's the key challenge, because in some ways retail hasn't changed an ounce since whenever it started. You still need to, if I'm selling flowers on the side of the road, I got to give a good product, decent price, decent experience. I better have get it there on time. Those aspects of why a consumer would go buy a thing from an entity. What it is hasn't changed. How you deliver it has changed radically over time, and we're in a major inflection point there, in my opinion. I think the other thing is what consumers value has shifted a bit. Like in the mid-2000s, brands were running away from customer experience. How could I, literally, I remember being a million discussions, how could I ever differentiate on customer experience? Anyone can copy that, throw out research, go after some other strategy. And yet, you look who's winning in the broader economy, and the Airbnb references are abundant. The Uber, like because they're solving it in such an exquisite way that's raising expectations for everyone in every sector. Like, it's shifting value creation for consumers. And so, back to the core question, all right, so why can't I do that if I'm Staples right now? Because I'm lugging behind me that one quadrant, and I don't know how to do it quick enough. And I don't, it's interesting to see which of the public companies will get there, which of the companies that have gone private will get there fast enough, because the transformational requirements are so significant. And if I have to keep delivering to Wall Street a certain pace every single year, I mean, it's a real challenge. I have huge empathy if you're the CEO of one of these big companies. What do you think?
So, absolutely aligned. I think that it will continue to increase, and it's. I think the velocity of that change is going to continue to absolutely increase. It's interesting when I think about my time at Target, kind of fighting. This is 2005, fighting kind of tooth and nail, and that was a little beyond where you were talking about with the customer experience differentiation, but just the idea of having a product manager responsible for the web experience as a product from the company. And now roll forward to now, and and I look at some of my colleagues who are still at Target, and they've got an army of product managers all focused on the digital product experience that people have interacting with Target. So that's been a major shift. At JCPenney, seeing the shift from kind of the conventional wisdom, and here you have a company, a retailer that's over 100 years old, and some of the stores actually, are the same store that was opened 110 years ago. And yet, in the last 2 years, we have accelerated like crazy the introduction of initially just service-oriented architecture so we could get out of our own way fast enough that the legacy systems wouldn't slow down the increasing pace. And now even that's not fast enough for the organization, and we're going even deeper with kind of the implementation of microservices so that everything can be handled in this single point situation that enables us to move incredibly fast. You really wonder what's next, because I don't believe it's going to slow down. And again, this is Moore's law again. Like, how is it going to get twice as fast? I don't know. But
on that conversation, we have this conversation where we go, look, you can read the Wall Street Journal and you'll read about 3D printing and artificial intelligence and augmented reality, and we all know the list of stuff that you'll read about. And I look at this data and I go, look, 3D printing, augmented reality, artificial intelligence are not driving any of this disruption. Right? Any of the data that you're looking at right now is not driven by any of those topics. Right? This is all being driven by what I would call first-generation internet technologies, XML, HTML, mobile technologies, things we knew about, 17, 18 years ago, right? They're just now really starting to accelerate back to the Moore's law idea.
Good point.
Meanwhile, we've got this entire collection of technologies that we're on the precipice. It's this tidal wave that's preparing to hit us, that we can't sort of separate the idea between disruption and things that are on the horizon, right? So if those continue to advance at the same rate and hit the industry, it's in my mind, it's cataclysmic, the potential impact that those could have.
I kind of feel a little bad here as I'm sitting here. I'm like, we're like the dismal economists, everyone just shut your books, go home, kiss your spouse, and the world is ending. Which I don't think is the case. No. I think, but that's what I'm like, is this the panel we signed up for? I think an interesting way to start to think about that is, don't take yourself, if you're a fancy consultant or a retail exec or a key supplier selling into retail, pick your favorite cousin who does nothing to do with this, and just ask the question, how's their retail life right now versus 5 years ago? How would they answer the question? Who they don't care, they may be a plumber or a nurse or whatever they do. How's your retail life? And what's interesting, I think they'd say, pretty good. Actually it's getting better.
Yep.
Freaking retailers are finally, insert whatever problem they had. I love Amazon and Amazon Prime. They ship it to me, and so I order extra stuff because I'm getting free shipping. Their lives are getting better, and it's on big things. It's even on small things. And one of the companies I advise is called My Alerts. You know, I've spent a lot of time trying to get 40 million Best Buy customers to keep coming back and guess what they wanted. And one of these companies that we're advising has a simple way to have a consumer say, oh, that's out of stock, can you remind me? Now, like, that is not what the company's website says, and that's not what the investor information says. But it is a functionality that's driving huge outcomes, financial outcomes for people like Home Depot. Sure. And that is not, like, remind me. How long has that thought been around? Like, a fairly long time. But now through technology, through all the other factors that we're like, oh shit, about right now, it's actually enabling on the other side a real opportunity to delight customers in new ways. You know, anyone who's had a food delivery, whether it's HelloFresh or whomever was, like, when that food comes and you don't have to freak out, when things are delivered within an hour, like, that's good. So I think it's interesting to think about, okay, if you're in one quadrant, it's kind of scary times, and how are we going to grow? You know, what's exciting about those other quadrants too?
And that's really why we put that together, because on one hand, this is all like gloom and doom. On the other hand, not everybody's losing. So let's learn, like, what is winning in the marketplace today, and why. If you think about why is that bottom left losing, it's because my point around scarcity to abundance, right? That quadrant, I call that quadrant places with stuff, okay? And frankly, there was a time where that wasn't a very effective strategy, right? If you had a lot of stores, you had good access to product, you had a supply chain to forward deploy it, you could make a profitable business by turning, you know, by having places with stuff. The problem is places are not nearly as important as they once were,
right.
And stuff, right, is so commoditized now, so accessible, that the profit margins around that are getting squeezed and the amount of shares being distributed. So what it tells us is we have to think about technology and innovation, but we have to think about where's the profit going, how's the model evolving, and how do we incorporate that into what we're doing. And look, you can win, and there are plenty of winners in the marketplace, but you have to recognize when the model begins to shift, to be effective, you have to begin to shift that model as well to win at the new game.
Yeah. And it seems to me, whether we like it or not, a lot of these models are being pushed from the forces and factors towards a customer lifetime value view of a relationship with a customer from a purely transactional. If you're in retail, you've had this discussion, you've probably written the slide yourself. But starting to embrace that in a completely new way is really what I think. You know, it was interesting. That's why I asked the question earlier, like, how do you forecast a story? Like, I just didn't know the answer to the question. That's what the Touch of Modern guy. But, like, how does he know what December sales are going to be when he doesn't know what stories he's going to tell, and he's not doing what exactly we just said, not buying 5 million of X and trying to push 5 million of it out and hoping, you know, he doesn't have to, you know, liquidate too much.
Well, that's the difference in my mind of being a supply chain-oriented company, supply-oriented, which, you know, I would argue the vast majority of retailers, especially the big guys, are really merchant-driven, right? So they buy stuff, they figure out the right stuff, and they go get it out there, and then they hope that it sells. To being customer-driven, right? And we all talk the talk about being customer-driven, but the truth is, retail has historically been a stuff-driven business, right?
Yep.
We have another chart that I didn't include, it'll be in the paper, about if you take disposable spending and you look at it and say what's being spent on stuff versus experiences, no surprise, we read about this, that this is really beginning to bifurcate. The amount of that's being spent on experiences is skyrocketing, the amount of stuff being spent on stuff is shrinking. Yep. So if you just looked at that, and if you were customer-centric, you'd probably ask the question, what does my customer want to buy from me? What would they expect to buy from me? And you might say, hey, maybe that's services. Maybe there's things other than stuff that I want to begin to include, and then you get to your point around lifetime value. Like, I own customers, I have a brand, and I have a different portfolio of things I sell because my customer tells me they want a different portfolio.
Yeah, I just think it's fascinating, and I think it'll drive us towards, you know, I haven't spent much time on that site, but, like, I wouldn't be surprised if they know the kinds of trips I'd like to buy, you know, go on,
sure.
and start to see that pop up in my product stream. Because they're like, well, guys like this, like these kinds of trips, guys like that, like those kinds of trips, and you like some other third kind of trip.
Sure.
And they'll start to segment down and figure out, okay, you know, Midwesterners like these ones and coastal guys like that or whatever. I think one of the areas, and I certainly don't have the answer to this, I think if you follow the customer lifetime value line of thinking in an earnest way, it'll force you to start to look at a different kind of metric and start to think about, like, what does engagement really look like over time? I'm sure you've been thinking deeply about this. But engagement, sort of when we all started the business, it was very simple. Engagement equaled transaction, yes or no. It's the only way we tracked it, so when we know how to track it, we're like, well, he's engaged because he bought.
Right.
Done. Are more of him? We buy more. And I think the formula for driving engagement, and you heard a little bit about this through referrals, through affiliates, it's a more complex stew now. And you'll start to figure out, okay, is it, what does the signal of walking into a store mean? Close rate should be going up. What does it mean that I ignored 3 emails but then opened 1? Like, that's a signal that we haven't done that next level math on, okay, 4 ignored emails, is that horrible or okay? BuzzFeed film watching that's noticed, website visit, like as we start to bring these signals into the marketing mix, you're gonna have a more sophisticated view of, where Touch of Modern will be, which is like, well, I just trust I can get you, and if I get $250 out of you in the next 2 years, done. We're happy. We just need to get more people. So I don't know. What are your thoughts?
It's been really interesting at trying to drive some of this change at JCPenney because, at the end of the day, right? I mean, we are one of those great big retailers with, that have built that model on the merchant model and the forward deployment of inventory. So, how much do you change overnight? But for us, one of the big things that we've done is really starting to look at those different types of measurements and those different metrics of success. It's been an interesting conversation beyond, as our mobile, for example, started driving a huge amount of additional traffic, so engagement. We were having triple-digit comp growth over the last couple of years, and our conversion numbers were heading down. Yeah. And you look at that and you go, okay, so did I just win or did I just lose?
Yeah, right.
I don't know. It depends on who you ask. So, it's been really fascinating to see how we've driven some of that change. And one of the big conversations has been around what's the target that we're actually aiming for. Specifically in the innovation space, we've tried to get very micro-targeted on what is the specific business lever that we think this innovation will move, and I think that speaks to your 10 boxes. Rather than trying to say, oh, everything that I do here is going to move my one overall important conversion metric, or pick whatever metric it is most important for you. We've looked at it and said, we've got an idea. And here is the metric that this one we think will move, and here's how we're going to determine if it does. And then as we've tried to bring those things very quickly into the field, we're focused only on that one particular piece. And so by doing that, rather than trying to run things up the typical corporate approval chain and make sure that everything moves the one overriding metric, we've really tried to empower the individuals doing the work to say, how is this particular thing going to affect the business? How are you going to measure it? And if you can answer those 2 questions, go run with this. Kind of take an agile approach, MVP, minimum necessary resources to get it out the door. Let's see if it moves that needle. And if so, then we can have a further conversation about, it's moving that needle, how important is that, and to focus on that.
Well, let's talk further about sort of innovation in the industry, because my observation is that about 3 years ago, the topic of innovation, really got attention. And so suddenly there was funding of these innovation labs. Most of them sort of got put out in San Francisco. Most of them got attached somehow to the digital, side of the equation. And then 3 years later, most of them, and I'm just generalizing here, most of them have struggled to do anything or to do much. Some of them have struggled to maintain funding. Right. And again, most of them focused on customer experience. So do you guys is that a fair observation? And if so, how is that evolution happening? Because if you think about our data that we presented, we said, the problem isn't that you don't have beacons in your store, and no offense to anybody that wants to put beacons in the store. The problem's much deeper than that, deeper than sort of refining the customer experience. This is more systemic than that. So give me your observations of that evolution.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're spot on. JCPenney did the exact same thing you just talked about, except that we chose New York rather than San Francisco for reasons I can't fully understand.
Restaurants, was it?
That may have been, everyone argues it's because the talent is there. And, obviously there's great talent in New York. But at the end of the day, it was the same exact challenge. It was decoupled from the rest of the business. It was purely focused on one or two boxes in your continuum, mostly digital. And I would argue that it was also focused on the I can't remember the exact words you used, the things that are on the horizon. It was focused on what are we going to do with 3D printers, and what are we going to do with AI, and whatever the du jour was 5 years ago. And what we found in 5 years' time is it was just a lot of cool ideas and a lot of money spent on high-end 3D printers and all of that kind of stuff. But it wasn't connected enough to the levers of the business that really mattered. And that was really, for us, what enabled us to transform and not shut down our innovation studio, was to take a step back and say, what are the levers that matter to us? And, and in some cases it was, is there a way that I can optimize margin on merchandise that would otherwise be heavily discounted? Is there a way I can drive one more incremental item in basket so that I can raise my AOV? And so, by taking this broad range of possible levers, I'm not saying this will work for everybody, but by taking that full range, what we said is it's not just the next cool thing. Like, if you can find a way to innovate on a lever that matters, let's give it a shot, and let's see if you can move that lever enough to make a big difference. That made all the difference for us. And the other thing we said is, you've got to produce. We absolutely have to get stuff out the door. My challenge to that team was, we've got to put something in production, in test, for sort of a fail fast model every 30 days. So the expectation is 12 things in production every year. We haven't quite gotten there, but we've gotten about 20 things out the door in 2 years.
So you sort of turned around the model from the death spiral to one that's productive.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And I think it addressed all of those things that you brought up. The investment, where do you put it? It's all back at headquarters now, because that was the only way to stay connected. Yeah. So it's all down in Plano.
Okay.
Bummer for those people who didn't want to or weren't able to make the move, but it was the right thing for the company, and it's I think we're on a good track.
Yeah. Observations?
I would agree. I think the question is this a strategic initiative or is it opportunistic? And everyone says, no, it's strategic, but then they treat it opportunistically. Like, let's stick it in San Francisco. Like, what's the strategy? And I think in anything you're trying to grow, you got to go back and it's the simple stuff. What number? Is it a big number? Does it matter if we move the big number? Big math matters. Little math, you monitor. Big math matters. And I think that's where people struggle. So, have I found a space where if I can move the big math, it moves another set of numbers? That's really important. I think the second thing, the biggest piece of innovation I was involved with was Best Buy Mobile, which was, okay, we're great at selling TVs, we're great at selling computers. I have a BlackBerry. Consumers seem to be getting phones. We don't really sell, we kind of sell phones. And taking that, slowing it down to be like, wait a minute, phones seem to matter. We have a right to play. And in that sort of strategic process, like, how much money is there in mobile? There's a shit ton of money in mobile. Like, if we figure this out, that's a big number worth, like, if we win big. And what we uncovered, which is very difficult for many of the companies, especially in the lower quadrant, is you kind of have to do a little bit of, like, look in the mirror work. Like, great. So if you're Best Buy at the time, you're like, well, we can go sell mobile. Yeah, no, we can't, because it's crazy complex. Consumers are confused. The carriers are a nightmare to work with. OEMs are all, like, it was a bit of a tangle. And so we had to go through that work to basically have the moment where we said, all right, we want to win in the space, but we suck at selling phones. And it wasn't until you got that last sentence out the mouth of the most senior person who helped us realize, yeah, we need to do a JV with someone who knows how to sell phones. And if we can take their operating model and put it in our asset base, we can grow this thing, from less than 1% to nearly 10% market share, beating Sprint 1 quarter. Like, that's the kind of growth you need to have. But you have to pick a big thing that matters. Yeah. You have to be honest about what you're good at and what you're not, and what help you need. And then you need to get a team together who's like, all right, the three of us, we're not going to do this. At the time, it wasn't a real great career move to leave home theater to go work on the dinky, mobile phone category that no one cared about. But if you create the right team and the right incentives, and you get people to believe, yeah, if we fix this, it's going to matter to our consumers. It's going to matter to our shareholders. We're going to make it matter to the team. You can actually get big innovation through as a strategy versus, put Put him on phones and see how he does, or give him the lab, or give her the lab, and let's see what she can do with it. So I think that's a bigger.
The story is phenomenal, because if you think about that in the context of the slide with the 9 boxes, right? The idea that you're going to JV with somebody is essentially building an ecosystem, right? There's a theory out now about sort of how you compete in the age of ecosystems, and the idea is, well, if I really went from the consumer back instead of me forward, I would say, what does the consumer want? How are they spending their money? What needs do they have? And I'm going to be the very best I can at creating the value proposition. And if that means I bring together the ecosystem, whether it's Amazon or in your story, Best Buy, then so be it, right? Yeah. The new technology allows that to occur. So I love that story because it sort of fits in that context. Yeah. So I'm looking at time here. We got about 17 seconds left. Any last comments before we wrap up?
You know, I think the most important thing I would say is just I think it's important to have the courage to kind of challenge that status quo. I think you've given a great framework. You know, I wish I'd had your 10-box model, but I think that's a great framework, and I think it takes a lot of courage to bring that into the organization. But I think that's what's absolutely necessary to move the needle.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would agree. We didn't spend as much time on that 10 box. I would suggest anyone who's creating anything of value, there was a time when you could rely on one home run hitter to merchants, step up, please hit this out of the park, we win. Or retail, please deliver for us because you're the only function who can do that. If you're going to create new, real, epic value, you better be looking across, whether it's those 10, it doesn't matter what 10.
Right.
When you sit the team down at the center of the table, you better have your IT guy there, you better have retail there, you better have a merchant, a marketer, finance. You better have an integrated team who's thinking in a more complex way about creating a simplified solution.
All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Cool. All right, thanks.
We hope you had a great first day at RIC 16. Now,
Thanks,
Debbie
you.
House is going to take the stage for one final time today to share some key takeaways and teasers for tomorrow.
So, great research, brilliant conversation. That was just great. It was high energy and a lot of really interesting thoughts and insights shared. It was a terrific way to end today. And we are going to head to cocktails. I think it would be a good idea to absorb all of what we've heard and learned today over a glass of wine or a cocktail. So just a couple of things that I thought were some key takeaways from today, and the first one is from our Rent the Runway and Earn and Roman discussion about B2H, and that's business to human data. Embracing your brand advocates, and I think we're talking about brand advocates in almost every discussion we have. I mean, we focused on it specifically in referral marketing, but any retail success story has brand advocates at the core at this point. Find new ways to think about innovation in a disruptive retail environment. That's something that is definitely going to be focused on tomorrow morning with our keynote speaker, Ken Hughes. He's going to be talking about experiential retail and positive disruption at 9 a.m. tomorrow, so don't miss Ken. He's an award-winning retail speaker. He's joining us from his home in Ireland, and he's going to be a terrific speaker tomorrow. And that's going to just lead into a great day of very impressive, enthusiastic retail speakers from Barry Beck of Blue Mercury to Jodie Foster from Shoes of Prey. We have a great panel that's going to talk about payment. We're going to have another panel that's going to talk about location-based marketing. We'll talk about beacons a little bit. So it's a great day, and we're going to finish up with Maureen Mullen from L2's think tank. So it's going to be another terrific day. We're going to have lunch over topic tables downstairs in the restaurant that's River Park, one of Tom Colicchio's restaurants downstairs. So that'll be fun too. So with that, and I talked through all of that already. And don't forget about our innovation labs tomorrow. And please schedule some one-on-one meetings with our sponsors who are right there. And thanks again to all of our sponsors from today, and particularly Xtoll, who is sponsoring our cocktail hour downstairs right now in the Cube, and I think the weather has held up really nicely, and we'll be able to have some fresh air as well. So please join us downstairs, and we will see you bright and early tomorrow morning. Thank you.